Hey, how y'all doing today? I hope everybody's doing well. You guys are staying safe, staying peaceful. Just wanted to go into part two of terrorism this week, right? And last class, I introduced the idea, or last lecture, I introduced the idea of the blowback theory. The idea that if you want to understand terrorism, there's two different kinds of terrorism. There's asymmetric terrorism, the kind of terrorism carried out by non-state actors like Al Qaeda or ISIS, right? Or and then there's state terrorism, the type of terrorism carried out by governments. Now, we're not usually taught that there's such a thing as state terrorism. The idea that governments can commit terrorism is, left off the entire news and the agenda of news setting for us. But I was saying, if you want to understand terrorism, you got to really understand both dynamics in play, right? So I'm arguing that asymmetric terrorism, right, is a response to state terrorism, right? It's another way to put it, it's called the blowback theory, the unintended consequences of government actions inciting hatred, and creating the conditions by which asymmetric terrorism is able to occur. So the classic example, right, of blowback would be 9/11, right? So the question needs to be asked, okay, so what led to 9/11 happening? Well, Osama bin Laden, who was the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks, he was part of a terrorist group called Al Qaeda. And there's no defending what he did. I mean, what he did was inhumane, it was despicable, should be universally condemned. Nonetheless, though, we should understand maybe what the U.S. government did that may have provoked the asymmetric terrorism, right? So from bin Laden's perspective, there's three major things the United States did that warranted the terrorist attacks of 9/11. One was our one-handed support for Israel, right? Israel and Palestine has been engaged. We talked about this earlier when we were meeting face to face. Israel and Palestine have been engaged in, a 60, 70-year struggle, right, over disputed territory, right? Israel believes the land they live on now is rightfully theirs because of biblical claims, and the Palestinians have long resided there. They've actually resided in that land. And obviously the Palestinians are dominant Muslims. The Israelis are dominant Jews, right? So the United States has, one-handedly supported Israel. We've given them weapons, insane amounts of weapons, military training, millions upon billions of dollars of funding to keep their occupation of Palestine going. Now, why did that upset Osama bin Laden, the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks? Because the Palestinians are predominantly Muslim, and we're seen as, and bin Laden is Muslim, and he views us as sort of supporting the enemy of Islam, right? So and everyone in that part of the world despises Israel for their occupation of Palestine. Actually, to be honest, most outside of the United States and Great Britain, most of the world's opinion has very much condemned Israel for their occupation of Palestine, which may sound very controversial to some of you here. That's just kind of like, the reality of the situation, right? Another thing bin Laden was upset with was the first Persian Gulf War in 1991 under George Bush Sr. He viewed that as a war of aggression upon Muslims everywhere. Even though he hated Saddam Hussein, who we ended up fighting in Iraq, he still viewed us as an enemy on foreign land. The third thing he didn't like is that the United States, beginning in the 90s and continuing up through 9/11 and even after, right, we've had a practice of setting up military bases all throughout the region of the Middle East. But controversially, we have 4 bases that are surrounding the 2 holy lands that every Muslim is more or less expected to pilgrimage to, Mecca and Medina. And bin Laden is up in arms, and all his supporters were up in arms. The United States has long held military bases in what are seen as Islamic holy lands, right? And there are other reasons for why 9/11 may have happened, but our support for Israel, the first Persian Gulf War, our military presence in the Middle East, particularly around the Holy Lands, were justifications for bin Laden to declare jihad, which is holy war. And he is, to be sure, he was an extremist, right? Bin Laden, we don't know really when he died. Some say he died in the Battle of Tora Bora in 2001, 2002 in Afghanistan. Others say he died when the Obama administration told us in 2009, which, supposedly his body was dumped, and that's the last we heard of it, which seems kind of strange to me, right? Now, where else do we see this blowback theory, this idea of asymmetric terrorism being a response to state terrorism? Well, the second Iraq war, the United States obviously, we invaded Iraq a second time. And this time under George W. Bush, the son of the first Bush, who carried out the first Iraq war, was responsible for this. And he didn't stop with he actually got rid of Saddam Hussein, which opened up a huge power vacuum between 2 rival groups that have been battling each other within the Islamic religion, and that is the Sunnis and the Shiites. The Sunnis represented sort of like the group that's associated with Saddam Hussein, even though Saddam Hussein wasn't religious and was more of a secularist. The Shiites, right, were repressed under Saddam Hussein's regime. So suddenly Saddam Hussein gets removed, a civil war erupts in Iraq, and guess who takes advantage of this entire civil war to push their own extremist religious agenda? The group called ISIS, or Islamic State. ISIS would not be able to recruit people if there wasn't the anger that came out of the Iraq war, right? So ISIS began in Iraq, and actually people don't know this, but ISIS actually started as the resistance movement against the U.S. occupation. So originally they began as the opposition that was trying to push the United States out of their country, and we were perceived by many as invaders or occupiers. And then that resistance movement grew into a fundamentalist religious movement that then became ISIS. In fact, you could argue that they began as a religious extremist movement, and then they took advantage of the U.S. occupation to recruit people who were angry that we were there, our troops were there, to grow their influence. So I argue, if Iraq didn't exist, and your articles argue this week, if the Iraq war hadn't happened, ISIS would not have risen into power. They wouldn't have nowhere near the kind of recruitment capabilities they got from that, right? So this is called the blowback theory. Again, the idea that and by the way, the U.S. occupation in Iraq was viewed as an act of state terrorism. It was condemned by much of the world, to be sure, right? So this idea of blowback, it's a very controversial theory because it does what? It places the blame for instances of terrorism upon the governments themselves. So it's saying that what asymmetric terrorists do is horrific barbaric acts, and what governments do are barbaric acts. Government carries out horrific actions on one end, and then then asymmetric terrorists carry out horrific acts in retribution. And you just have this vicious cycle. And the more that we don't talk about state terrorism, the more likely asymmetric terrorism will continue to occur without an understanding of why that is. You guys take care, be well, and I hope you guys stay peaceful.